My son-in-law called me a freeloader at a charity gala and told an entire ballroom that I had spent my life living off other people's kindness without ever giving anything back. I remember every face that turned toward me that night. I remember the polite smiles fading into quiet judgment. I remember the sound of crystal glasses settling onto linen-covered tables as conversations stopped one by one. "Richard has always been good at showing up when someone else is paying," Jason said with an easy laugh, lifting his champagne glass as if he were sharing an amusing family story. A few people chuckled. Others nodded because they had no reason not to believe him. My daughter lowered her eyes without saying a word. I stood there holding a glass of sparkling water that suddenly felt heavier than it should have. I could have answered him. I could have defended myself. Instead, I simply looked across the ballroom toward the auction stage, where the auctioneer had just reached for the microphone, with an expression I couldn't quite understand. What happened next changed far more than my reputation. It changed the way I understood silence, family, and the price of letting other people tell your story. Before we continue, I'd like to ask one small favor. If this story truly resonates with you, let me know where you're watching from by sharing your city or country, along with your local time. I always find comfort in knowing that stories have a way of traveling farther than the people who live them. My name is Richard Bennett. I'm 68 years old, and until that evening at the Fairmont Copley Plaza in Boston, Massachusetts, I believed that dignity meant keeping quiet when someone misunderstood you. I had spent most of my life believing that good deeds didn't need applause. That night taught me that silence sometimes allows lies to grow louder than the truth. Stay with me until the very end because the people sitting in that ballroom believed they knew exactly who I was. None of them knew the story that had begun decades before that microphone was ever switched on. The gala was held every autumn, and it had become one of Boston's most anticipated charity evenings. Business owners, physicians, university trustees, retired judges, and local families filled the grand ballroom long before sunset. Gold chandeliers reflected against polished marble floors. A string quartet played quietly near the entrance while volunteers welcomed guests with warm smiles. It was the kind of event where everyone seemed to know someone important. I had almost decided not to attend. My old Navy suit had been pressed that morning, but it was still the same suit I'd worn to my wife's memorial service 3 years earlier. The sleeves had become slightly loose around my wrists. My shoes were polished, though the leather had begun to soften with age. I looked at myself in the mirror before leaving home and smiled a little. "You'll do just fine," I whispered to the empty hallway. There was no one left in the house to answer me anymore. Emily had insisted I come. "Dad," she had said over the phone 2 weeks earlier, "Jason's company sponsored one of the auction tables this year. We'd really love for you to join us." I hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Of course." She laughed softly. "It's family." Family. That word used to make me feel safe. Now it usually made me pause before answering. When I arrived at the hotel, Jason greeted people before he greeted me. He shook hands, exchanged business cards, and laughed loudly with executives whose names I didn't recognize. When he finally noticed me, he smiled just enough to be polite. "Richard, glad you made it. Good to see you too, Jason." He glanced down at my suit for half a second before looking back into my eyes. "Pretty formal night." I smiled. "That's usually how charity galas work." He laughed, although I wasn't sure he found me funny. Emily walked over and kissed my cheek. "You look handsome, Dad." "Thank you, sweetheart." Jason adjusted his cufflinks. "Let's just hope nobody mistakes you for one of the volunteers." Emily nudged him gently. "Jason." "What?" he replied with another laugh. "I'm joking." I laughed too because sometimes pretending not to be heard is easier than explaining why you are. We found our table near the center of the ballroom. Jason introduced me several times throughout dinner. "This is my father-in-law, Richard." Then he would pause for just a fraction of a second before adding something that sounded harmless on the surface. "He's been enjoying retirement for quite a while now." "Must be nice," one guest said. Jason smiled. "Oh, I think Richard has mastered the art of letting life take care of him." Everyone laughed politely. I smiled again. I had learned that correcting small insults only encouraged larger conversations. Between courses, I excused myself and walked toward one of the tall windows overlooking Copley Square. Boston looked peaceful beneath the evening lights. Cars moved slowly through the streets below, while people hurried along the sidewalks carrying umbrellas against the cool autumn drizzle. "Beautiful view, isn't it?" a familiar voice asked. I turned and found Walter Hughes standing beside me. We'd known each other for nearly 40 years. "Still hiding near the windows when parties get noisy?" he asked. "Old habits," I answered. Walter studied my face for a moment. "You okay?" "I'm fine." He didn't believe me. Good friends rarely do. He folded his hands in front of him. "Jason talks too much." I looked back toward the ballroom. "He's ambitious." Walter nodded slowly. "Sometimes ambition makes people confuse confidence with kindness." Before I could answer, the lights dimmed slightly, signaling the beginning of the evening's live auction. Guests returned to their seats. Volunteers placed thick catalogs beside every bidder. Jason straightened his jacket and leaned toward me. "Tonight should be interesting." "I hope they raise plenty of money," I said. He smiled without looking at me. "Oh, they will." As the auctioneer stepped onto the stage, I noticed something unusual. She wasn't carrying only the auction catalog. In her other hand was a cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. She glanced toward someone near the front row, gave a nearly invisible nod, and carefully placed the envelope beside the microphone before greeting the audience. I had attended enough charity events over the years to know that sealed envelopes almost never appeared during live auctions. For reasons I couldn't explain, my heart began beating just a little faster. The auctioneer welcomed everyone, thanked the sponsors, and began introducing the first items of the evening, but I barely heard a word she said. My attention drifted somewhere else entirely. It always happened that way whenever I found myself surrounded by people who believed they already knew me. My mind would quietly return to another time, back to the years when my family still gathered around one dinner table and laughter came without effort. There was a time when Emily reached for my hand without hesitation. There was a time when she believed I could fix almost anything. When she was 8 years old, she once came home crying because another little girl had laughed at her drawing. I sat beside her at the kitchen table while she pushed crayons across the wood with watery eyes. "Maybe she was right," Emily whispered. "Maybe I'm not very good." I smiled and slid a blank sheet of paper toward her. "Being good isn't the first step." She looked at me. "Then what is?" "Having the courage to keep drawing after someone tells you not to." She thought about that for a long moment before picking up the blue crayon again. That picture stayed on our refrigerator for almost 10 years. Even after the edges curled from the magnets, I could never bring myself to throw it away. My wife Helen used to tease me. "Richard," she would laugh, "one day our kitchen is going to become an art museum." I would not mind, I always answered. Every masterpiece has to start somewhere. Helen understood me better than anyone ever had. She knew I preferred helping quietly instead of talking about it. If a neighbor's porch needed repairing, I would show up on Saturday morning with my toolbox before they even finished drinking their coffee. If someone at church lost a job, groceries somehow appeared on their doorstep without a return address. Helen never asked why I refused to tell people. She simply smiled whenever she found another receipt folded inside one of my coat pockets. "You know," she once said while we were washing dishes together, "most people want credit." I shrugged. "Credit feeds pride. I would rather feed people." She reached over, squeezed my arm, and whispered, "That is one of the reasons I married you." Those words stayed with me long after she was gone. When Emily met Jason during graduate school, I honestly wanted to like him. He was confident, articulate, and always knew exactly what to say in a room full of strangers. During our first dinner together, he complimented Helen's roast chicken, asked thoughtful questions about my business, and insisted on helping clear the plates afterward. As he carried dishes into the kitchen, Helen smiled at me. "He has good manners." I nodded. "He certainly knows how to make a first impression." Looking back now, I realize there is a difference between kindness and performance. At the time, I did not see it. None of us did. After they became engaged, Jason often asked me for advice. "Richard," he said one afternoon while we were walking through my garage, "how did you build a business from nothing?" I laughed. Nothing is a strong word. I started with an old pickup truck, 2 borrowed tools, and more mistakes than I can count. You make it sound easy. It never was. He listened carefully, nodding at every sentence. "People only notice the years after success," I told him. "They rarely notice the years before it." He smiled. I hope I can build something like that one day. You can, I answered. Just remember that your reputation grows slower than your income and disappears much faster. I thought he understood. Maybe he wanted to. Maybe he simply remembered the words because they sounded useful later. The first real change happened after Helen passed away. Grief changes the rhythm of a house. Rooms become quieter without anyone asking them to. The kitchen clock suddenly sounds louder. Empty chairs seem larger than they really are. For months, I found myself setting out 2 coffee mugs before realizing there was only one person left to drink it. Emily visited every Sunday during that first year. She would bring homemade soup, help organize the pantry, and ask if I needed anything. I worry about you, she admitted once while folding laundry. I know. You do not have to be strong all the time, Dad. I smiled. Being strong is not the same as pretending everything is fine. She hugged me before leaving. Those Sundays became something I quietly depended on. Then Jason's career began taking off. Promotions came quickly. Bigger clients followed. Dinner conversations slowly changed. Instead of asking how everyone was doing, Jason talked about market shares, executive retreats, networking events, and investment opportunities. I listened because I was proud that my son-in-law was succeeding. Somewhere along the way, however, success became the only language he respected. One evening we were eating at their house when Emily mentioned that I had spent the afternoon helping an elderly neighbor replace a broken wheelchair ramp. Jason laughed lightly while cutting his steak. You still spend your weekends doing free jobs? Sometimes people need help, I replied. They could hire someone. Not everyone can afford that. He shrugged. Time is money, Richard. I looked at him for a moment before answering. Sometimes time is love. The room became quiet. Emily changed the subject almost immediately, but I noticed Jason's expression. He smiled politely. Yet there was something behind his eyes that I had never seen before. It was not disagreement, it was dismissal. After that night, little comments began appearing more often. Dad does not really understand how business works anymore. Richard likes keeping things simple. Retirement gives people a lot of free time. None of those remarks sounded cruel by themselves. Together, they slowly reshaped the way people looked at me. Friends of Jason's began speaking to him whenever financial decisions came up, even inside my own home. Contractors asked him questions about houses I owned. Waiters placed the dinner check beside his plate, although I had invited everyone. The strange thing about losing respect is that it rarely happens all at once. It disappears one quiet conversation at a time until one day everyone assumes it was never there. Walter noticed long before I admitted it to myself. We met every Thursday morning at the same small diner in Lexington. One rainy morning he stirred his coffee and asked, "Have you ever thought that Jason enjoys making himself look taller by pretending everyone else is shorter?" I looked out the window for a while before answering. Maybe I have simply gotten older. Walter shook his head. Age has nothing to do with dignity, Richard. I smiled faintly. Then, why does it feel like I am slowly becoming invisible? Walter did not answer right away. Instead, he looked at me with the kind of sadness that only old friends carry. Invisible people, he finally said, usually have stories nobody bothered to ask about. At the time, I thought he was talking about my past. I had no idea he was also talking about the secret that was quietly waiting inside a sealed envelope only a few feet away from where I was sitting that very night. The first item sold for $35,000. A weekend on Nantucket brought even more. The ballroom filled with applause after every winning bid, and for a while I almost convinced myself that perhaps the evening would pass without incident. I should have known better. Jason had never been satisfied with simply being noticed. He always wanted to own the room. During a short intermission, servers moved between the tables with coffee and dessert. Conversations became louder as people stretched their legs and introduced themselves to strangers. Jason stood, buttoned his jacket, and looked toward a group of executives gathered near one of the sponsored displays. "Richard," he said, "come with me." I looked up from my untouched slice of cheesecake. "Why?" "I want you to meet a few people." Emily smiled. "Go on, Dad. It might be nice." I followed him across the ballroom, weaving between round tables covered with white roses and silver candle holders. The executives welcomed Jason with firm handshakes. "Gentlemen," Jason said confidently, "this is my father-in-law, Richard Bennett." A tall man wearing rimless glasses extended his hand. "Pleasure to meet you, Richard. Jason has spoken highly of his family." "Thank you," I replied. We exchanged a few polite words about the event before another guest asked me, "So what keeps you busy these days?" Before I could answer, Jason spoke for me. "Richard enjoys retirement." Everyone smiled politely. "Nothing wrong with that," one woman said. Jason laughed. "Well, somebody has to enjoy life while the rest of us keep the economy running." A few people chuckled. I forced a smile that felt thinner than paper. "Retirement has been busier than I expected," I answered calmly. "There is always someone who needs a hand." Jason tilted his head. "You still do those little volunteer projects?" "Sometimes. You really should charge people. Not everything has to become a business." He laughed again, louder this time. "That is exactly the difference between your generation and mine." Nobody argued with him. They simply watched us with the uncomfortable expressions people wear when they sense a family disagreement approaching. I quietly excused myself and returned to our table. Walter looked up from his coffee. "Everything all right?" "Of course," he sighed. "You always say that right before things get worse." I smiled faintly because he was usually right. A few minutes later, Emily sat beside me while Jason continued speaking with his business friends across the room. She reached over and touched my arm. "I am sorry." "For what?" "Sometimes he gets carried away." "Does he?" She looked toward Jason. "He likes making people laugh." I nodded slowly. "There is a difference between making people laugh and making someone the joke." Emily stared at the tablecloth. "I know." I waited, hoping she might say more. Instead, she whispered, "Things have been stressful lately. Is he treating you well?" She answered too quickly, "Yes." Then she looked away before adding, "Mostly." Mostly. One word. That was all it took to make my heart heavier. Before I could ask another question, Jason returned, carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. "Ready for the big finale?" he asked cheerfully. Emily forced a smile. "I suppose." He leaned closer toward me. "The last part of tonight is where the real money comes in." "I hope the foundation reaches its goal," I replied. "Oh, they will." He lowered his voice just enough that only the 3 of us could hear. Although I have to admit, something always fascinates me about charity events. I looked at him. "What is that?" "The people who love attending them the most are usually the ones writing the smallest checks." Emily frowned. "Jason," he waved a hand dismissively. "Relax, I am speaking generally." Then he looked directly into my eyes. "At least the donors are the ones carrying everyone else." I held his gaze for several seconds before answering. "There are many ways to carry people. Money is the important one. Not always. It is in this room." He smiled politely and walked away before I could respond. Walter had heard enough to understand exactly what had happened. "He is setting something up," he muttered. "What makes you think that?" "Because he keeps repeating the same point." I looked toward the stage where volunteers were arranging the final display. "Maybe I am imagining it." Walter shook his head. "No. Men my age have learned to recognize the sound of someone sharpening a knife with words." The lights dimmed again. Guests slowly returned to their seats. The chairman of the foundation walked onto the stage and thanked everyone for another successful year. He spoke about scholarships, community programs, and medical research grants. I listened carefully because those causes had always mattered to me. Then something unexpected happened. The chairman smiled toward the auctioneer and said, "Before our final live auction begins, there is one tradition we have postponed for many years." I noticed the auctioneer glance once more toward the cream-colored envelope resting beside the microphone. She did not open it. "Not yet." Jason leaned toward Emily with curiosity. "That is new." One of the guests at our table asked, "What tradition?" Another replied, "No idea. I have been attending for 8 years, and I have never seen this before." Walter slowly turned toward me. "Richard." I looked at him. "What? Do you know anything about this?" I answered honestly. "No." Across the room, one of the foundation board members walked onto the stage carrying a thin leather folder. He exchanged a quiet word with the auctioneer before handing it to her. She nodded respectfully. Something about the exchange felt unusually formal, almost ceremonial. The room grew silent. Even the waitstaff stopped moving between the tables. Jason folded his arms with an amused smile. "Well," he whispered, "this should be entertaining." The auctioneer rested one hand gently on the sealed envelope before looking out across the ballroom. Her eyes slowly scanned the audience, passing over dozens of familiar faces until, for the briefest moment, they stopped on mine. She offered a small, almost imperceptible smile, as though recognizing someone she had been waiting to see, and then she said, "Before we continue tonight's auction, there is someone in this room whose story deserves to be told." The ballroom became so quiet that I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning somewhere above the chandeliers. Every conversation disappeared. Every fork rested against porcelain. The auctioneer stood motionless for a brief moment, her hand still resting on the sealed envelope as though she understood the weight of what she was about to say. "Good evening," she began with a warm smile. "My name is Margaret Collins, and I have had the privilege of serving as this foundation's auctioneer for the past 12 years. A ripple of polite applause moved through the room before fading again. "Every year," she continued, "this organization recognizes individuals who have changed lives in ways that rarely make headlines. Tonight, before we present our final auction item, our Board of Trustees has asked us to honor a tradition that has remained private for nearly 2 decades. Curious whispers floated from table to table. Jason leaned back comfortably in his chair, clearly assuming another wealthy executive was about to receive public praise. I remained still, my fingers wrapped loosely around my untouched glass. Walter quietly glanced at me but said nothing. Margaret looked toward the front row. "Mr. Thomas Reynolds, would you please join me?" The chairman of the foundation rose from his seat. At 71 years old, Thomas carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needed to impress anyone. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his dark blue tuxedo fit him with understated elegance. As he stepped onto the stage, nearly everyone in the ballroom applauded. Thomas Reynolds had spent decades leading charitable organizations throughout Massachusetts. His reputation for integrity was known far beyond Boston. He accepted the microphone with an easy smile. "Thank you, Margaret." His voice carried naturally through the ballroom without needing to be raised. "Many of you know me because of my work with this foundation. What some of you may not know is that I spent more than 30 years as an attorney before dedicating my retirement to nonprofit service." He paused, allowing the room to settle completely. "One lesson I learned during those years is that the people who seek recognition are not always the people creating the greatest good." A thoughtful silence followed. Jason folded his hands confidently on the table. "Tonight," Thomas continued, "I have been given permission to share something that has remained confidential for many years." He turned toward Margaret. She handed him the leather folder but not the envelope. He opened it carefully and smiled as though remembering an old friend. 18 years ago, our foundation received an unexpected visit from a gentleman who asked a very unusual question. Thomas looked down briefly before reading from the notes. "If someone wanted to help without ever having their name printed in a program, could that be arranged?" Several guests exchanged curious glances. I remember asking him why anonymity mattered so much. Thomas closed the folder halfway and smiled gently. His answer has stayed with me ever since. He looked out across the ballroom. "Because the scholarship should be remembered, not the donor." Something inside my chest tightened. I had not heard those words repeated in 18 years. Thomas continued speaking. "Over the years, many people have tried to discover the identity of that donor. Board members changed. Staff members retired. Auditors came and went. Yet only a very small number of us ever knew his name because that was the promise we made." Walter slowly turned toward me again. This time, his expression was no longer curious. It was searching. Emily looked from Thomas to Jason and back again without understanding where the story was leading. Jason whispered quietly, "Interesting." Thomas smiled. "Some people measure generosity by the size of a check. Others measure it by how loudly someone talks about giving. I have learned that true generosity often leaves no fingerprints." The room remained completely silent. Margaret stepped beside him and added softly, "The board recently received written authorization from that donor, allowing us for the first time to share his identity publicly during this year's gala." Jason leaned slightly forward. "Now that," he murmured to one of the executives beside him, is good marketing. The executive smiled politely but said nothing. Thomas looked toward the audience once again. Before we reveal that name, I would like to tell you one more story. He folded the leather folder closed and rested both hands on the podium. About 12 years ago, one of our scholarship recipients invited several board members to her medical school graduation. She told us that without one anonymous scholarship renewed every single year, she would have left college after her sophomore year. He smiled warmly. Today she is a pediatric surgeon at Massachusetts General Hospital. A quiet murmur spread through the ballroom. A few years later, another young man stood before this same board after completing law school. He said something I have never forgotten. Thomas glanced down, as though hearing the young man's voice again. I have spent years wondering who believed in me before I believed in myself. Emily slowly lowered her eyes. Walter folded his arms tightly. Jason's confident smile had begun to fade, although only slightly. Thomas continued. The anonymous donor refused every invitation to attend ceremonies, refused every request for photographs, refused interviews. In 18 years, he accepted exactly one condition. Margaret nodded. That condition was simple. Thomas smiled. If his identity were ever revealed, it would only happen when the foundation believed the story might inspire others to give, without expecting applause. He stepped away from the podium for a moment and looked directly toward the center of the ballroom. His eyes settled on me with unmistakable warmth. I felt Emily notice it. I felt Walter notice it. Even Jason followed his line of sight before looking back toward the stage with growing confusion. Thomas spoke again, his voice quieter now. Sometimes extraordinary people spend years believing no one sees them. He reached toward Margaret. Without a word, she lifted the cream-colored envelope and carefully placed it into his hands. The dark blue wax seal caught the light from the chandeliers. Thomas held the envelope for a long moment before breaking the seal with deliberate care. The sound of the paper opening seemed impossibly loud inside the silent ballroom. He unfolded a single cream-colored letter, looked at the first line, smiled to himself, then slowly raised his eyes toward me once more. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, the time has finally come for all of you to meet the man who has quietly changed thousands of lives. For a moment, Thomas Reynolds did not read the letter. He simply looked around the ballroom, almost inviting everyone to appreciate the importance of silence before the truth arrived. I noticed people leaning forward in their chairs. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving. Every eye was fixed on the stage. Thomas smiled softly. Before I tell you his name, I would like to explain why our board voted unanimously to honor his wishes tonight. He lowered the letter slightly. Because generosity is often misunderstood. We assume it belongs to the wealthiest person in the room. Sometimes it belongs to the quietest. Jason shifted in his chair beside Emily. This is becoming dramatic, he whispered. Emily did not answer. She was watching Thomas with an expression I had not seen since she was a little girl trying to solve a difficult puzzle. Thomas continued, the gentleman I am speaking about never attended our annual recognition dinners, never accepted awards, never allowed photographs. In fact, several members of our own board never met him face to face because he always scheduled his meetings before sunrise or after office hours. A few guests smiled with curiosity. He once apologized for arriving in work clothes because he had driven directly from a construction site. Light laughter drifted through the ballroom. I lowered my eyes toward my hands. They looked older than I remembered. The faint white scars across my knuckles had never completely faded. They came from decades of lifting lumber, carrying concrete forms, repairing roofs, and building houses before sunrise. Thomas looked toward the audience again. One morning I asked him why he insisted on handling paperwork personally, instead of sending an accountant. He laughed quietly. He told me, if I am willing to earn every dollar with my own hands, I should be willing to deliver every gift with them too. Walter smiled to himself. Very few people knew that I had always believed paperwork deserved the same honesty as hard labor. Across the table, one of Jason's business associates whispered, that sounds like somebody from another generation. Jason nodded absent-mindedly, though his confidence seemed less certain than before. Thomas opened the leather folder again. Over 18 years, the anonymous donor never asked us how many newspaper articles mentioned the foundation. He turned a page carefully. He only asked 2 questions every year. He looked toward Margaret. How many students stayed in school? Margaret answered with a warm smile. And how many families slept a little easier this year? Thomas nodded. Those were always his first questions. I remembered every one of those meetings. I remembered sitting across from Thomas with a legal pad filled with handwritten notes instead of spreadsheets. I remembered asking about the students by name whenever possible because numbers never told the whole story. A scholarship was not simply tuition. It was a father working fewer overnight shifts. It was a mother worrying a little less. It was a young person receiving permission to dream. None of those things fit neatly inside financial reports. Thomas reached into the folder once more and removed several worn photographs. These remain in our archives. An assistant placed enlarged images onto the screen behind him. The first showed a small scholarship ceremony nearly 15 years earlier. Faces smiled toward the camera. One chair near the back remained empty. That chair, Thomas said gently, was reserved every year for our anonymous donor. Someone in the audience asked, "Why was it empty?" Thomas smiled. Because he never came. The next photograph appeared. It showed volunteers loading boxes of books into a community literacy center. Once again, an empty parking space near the entrance had been marked with a handwritten sign reading, "Reserved guest." He donated the books, Thomas explained, then left before anyone arrived. Soft laughter filled the room again, this time carrying admiration instead of amusement. Jason frowned slightly. "Who does that?" one guest quietly wondered. Walter answered from our table before anyone else could. "Someone who believes gratitude belongs to the people receiving help, not the person giving it." Several nearby guests turned toward Walter with thoughtful expressions. Thomas continued reading. "There is another detail very few people know." He paused. Our donor insisted that no scholarship recipient should ever feel indebted to him personally. He glanced at the audience. He believed kindness should free people, never burden them. Emily slowly covered her mouth with one hand. I noticed tears beginning to gather in her eyes, although she still had no idea why. She simply seemed moved by the story itself. Thomas closed the folder halfway. Several years ago, one recipient finally tracked down our office after becoming a successful architect. She wanted to repay every dollar she had received. He smiled warmly. The donor declined. Quiet murmurs moved through the ballroom. Thomas continued. Instead, he sent her a handwritten note. Margaret unfolded a small card from inside the folder. "If your life becomes easier, make someone else's easier. That will repay everything." The room fell silent once again. I recognized the words immediately. I had written them late one evening at my kitchen table, after thinking about Helen for hours. She always believed kindness should continue moving, like ripples across a lake after a single stone touched the water. Jason crossed his arms more tightly. His smile had disappeared completely now. One of the executives beside him leaned over and whispered, "I hope they tell us who this man is." Jason forced a nod. "So do I." His voice sounded different now, less certain, more cautious. Thomas carefully folded the note and placed it back inside the folder. "There is one final reason tonight matters." He looked directly toward Margaret before continuing. "Our anonymous donor recently informed the board that he wishes to reduce his responsibilities with the foundation." A soft murmur spread through the ballroom. "Age catches all of us eventually," Thomas said gently. "He told me something during our last meeting that I have thought about almost every day since then." He unfolded another sheet of paper. "If people ever learn my name, I hope they remember that I was simply a man who kept one promise to his wife." My throat tightened unexpectedly. Helen, even after all these years, hearing her mentioned aloud felt like opening a window to a room I had kept closed for too long. Emily looked toward me for only a second before turning back to the stage. Perhaps she noticed something in my expression. Perhaps she was simply wondering why those words suddenly felt familiar. Thomas carefully lifted the cream-colored letter once more. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said softly, "inside this letter is the authorization he signed only 3 months ago." He broke eye contact with the audience and looked down at the elegant signature resting near the bottom of the page. His smile widened with unmistakable affection. Then, for the first time all evening, he spoke a single sentence that caused every heartbeat in my chest to stop. "Richard, after all these years, I believe it is finally time for you to stand." For a few seconds, I did not move. I honestly wondered whether I had heard him correctly. My name seemed to linger in the air long after Thomas Reynolds spoke it, as if the ballroom itself needed time to catch up. Around me, chairs creaked softly as people turned in my direction. Dozens of unfamiliar faces searched for the man they had apparently overlooked all evening. Walter placed one steady hand on my shoulder. "Go on," he said quietly. "They are waiting." I let out a slow breath and rose from my chair. I did not feel proud. I did not feel victorious. Mostly, I felt embarrassed by the attention. My father used to tell me that if you did something worth talking about, you should probably let someone else do the talking. I had spent most of my life trying to follow that advice. Emily stared at me without blinking. "Dad," she whispered. I looked at her and offered the smallest smile. "It is all right." But I was not certain that it was. Thomas waited patiently until I was standing before continuing. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said warmly, "Richard Bennett has spent the last 18 years quietly supporting this foundation." A murmur swept through the ballroom. During those years, he personally funded scholarships, literacy programs, emergency education grants, and several community partnerships through anonymous donations. Every contribution was documented. Every gift followed the same instruction. Thomas unfolded the letter and read aloud. "No recognition, no plaques, no speeches. If a student succeeds, that is the only reward I need." The room became completely still again. I noticed one elderly couple exchange surprised glances. A physician seated near the stage slowly removed his glasses as though trying to see me more clearly. One of Jason's business associates leaned toward him and whispered, "Your father-in-law?" Jason did not answer immediately. He kept staring at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not anger, it was confusion. Margaret stepped beside Thomas, carrying another folder. "Several members of tonight's audience have unknowingly benefited from Richard's generosity," she said. "Some received scholarships. Others worked with organizations that survived because emergency funding arrived when no one else stepped forward." She opened the folder carefully. "Our records include hundreds of letters from families who never learned his name." She smiled gently toward me. "Until tonight." Emily slowly stood from her chair. Her eyes had filled with tears. "Dad," she said again, her voice trembling now, "why did you never tell me?" I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because it was never supposed to be about me." She shook her head softly. "Not even once?" I smiled sadly. "Your mother and I made that decision together many years ago." Hearing Helen mentioned again brought another wave of quiet emotion across the room. Thomas nodded. Richard's late wife believed that kindness should remain free from applause. Together they established the first scholarship with enough savings to help one nursing student complete her education. He turned another page. That single scholarship eventually became an endowment supporting thousands of students over nearly 2 decades. A woman seated near the front slowly raised her hand even though this was not a meeting. "Excuse me," Thomas smiled. "Yes?" She stood. "My daughter received one of those scholarships." Her voice cracked slightly. "She graduated from medical school 6 years ago." Thomas nodded warmly. "Then your family is part of Richard's story." The woman looked directly at me. "Sir, thank you." I lowered my head politely. "Please thank your daughter by helping someone else when she has the chance." The woman smiled through tears before quietly sitting down. Another voice spoke from the opposite side of the ballroom. "My grandson attended college because of that emergency fund, after my son lost his job during the recession." An older gentleman slowly stood. "We never knew who made that possible." Before I could answer, Thomas gently lifted one hand. "Richard asked us years ago not to identify recipients publicly. Tonight we will continue honoring that promise." The gentleman nodded respectfully before sitting again. The atmosphere inside the ballroom had changed completely. Earlier that evening, people had smiled politely whenever Jason joked about me. Now, many of those same faces looked uncomfortable, as though replaying every conversation they had shared since arriving. I did not blame them. They had simply believed the story placed before them. Jason finally stood. He forced a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Well," he said with an uneasy laugh, "this is certainly unexpected." Nobody laughed with him. He cleared his throat. "Richard never mentioned any of this to us." Thomas answered before I could. That was intentional. Jason looked toward him. I just mean, he searched for the right words. Families usually know these things. Walter quietly replied from our table. Only if someone asks the right questions. Jason ignored him. I was not trying to disrespect anyone. His voice sounded tighter now. He looked toward me. I did not know. I met his eyes calmly. That part is true. He seemed relieved for a brief second, as though I had offered him an escape. Then I continued. But not knowing someone's story is different from deciding you already know it. The sentence hung quietly between us. I had not raised my voice. I had not accused him. I simply spoke the truth as gently as I could. Emily wiped tears from her face. Dad, all those Saturdays. I nodded. Yes. When you said you had errands? Most of those errands were foundation meetings, scholarship interviews, or visits with organizations that needed help. She covered her mouth with both hands. I know what you thought. She looked down at the table. I never asked. No, I said softly. You never did. Thomas stepped away from the podium and walked toward me, carrying the cream-colored letter. There is one final matter, he said. When Richard agreed to let us reveal his identity, he also agreed to something else. He handed me the envelope. This belongs to you now. I looked at it without opening it. What is it? Thomas smiled. The board prepared one final document for tonight. Jason frowned. Another document? Thomas nodded. Yes. He turned toward the audience. For 18 years, Richard Bennett quietly declined every public honor we offered. This year, after considerable discussion, the board unanimously decided that one request could no longer be refused. The ballroom grew silent once more. Thomas looked directly at me with the same patient smile he had worn since stepping onto the stage. Richard, he said, before you decide whether to accept it, I think everyone here deserves to know exactly what this document will ask of you. No one spoke for several seconds after Thomas finished. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt thoughtful, almost reverent, as though every person in that ballroom had suddenly realized they were standing inside a story they had completely misunderstood only minutes earlier. Thomas looked at me with the same patient expression he had worn since the beginning of the evening. Richard, he said gently, before you answer, I would like everyone here to understand what this document represents. He turned toward the audience once more. The board has voted unanimously to establish the Helen and Richard Bennett Legacy Scholarship, ensuring that the work these two remarkable people began will continue for generations. A warm round of applause filled the ballroom. It was not loud or theatrical. It sounded sincere. I looked down for a moment. Hearing Helen's name spoken in that room meant more to me than hearing my own ever could. Your wife deserves to be remembered, Thomas continued. Many of these students exist in this room because of promises the two of you quietly kept together. I slowly shook my head. Thomas, Helen would have been embarrassed by all of this. He smiled. Perhaps, but she would also understand that gratitude has its own responsibilities. I held the envelope without opening it. The paper felt surprisingly heavy in my hands. Emily stepped closer until she stood beside me. She looked at the envelope, then at me. Dad, she whispered. Mom never told me. She honored the promise we made. Emily's eyes filled again. I wish I had asked more questions. I reached over and gently squeezed her hand. We all think there will always be more time. That simple sentence seemed to reach farther than I intended. Several guests quietly lowered their eyes. Walter smiled faintly across the table. He had lost his wife 5 years before Helen passed away. He understood exactly what I meant. Jason remained standing, but now he seemed strangely alone despite the crowded ballroom around him. Earlier in the evening, people had gathered near him effortlessly. Now the executives who had laughed at his jokes remained silent. One of them, a gray-haired banker named Charles Whitmore, finally spoke. Jason. Jason turned quickly. Yes? Charles folded his arms. You introduced Richard as someone who had never helped anyone. Jason swallowed. That was a very specific statement. Jason looked around as though searching for support. Based on what I knew, Charles nodded slowly. Or based on what you assumed? Jason hesitated. The distinction seemed to catch him off guard. Another woman seated nearby joined the conversation. Assumptions can be expensive. Her tone was calm rather than accusing. Jason forced a nervous laugh. Look, none of us knew, Walter quietly replied. Some of us knew enough not to judge. Jason looked toward Walter. You knew? Walter smiled gently. No. I simply knew Richard well enough to understand there was always more beneath the surface than he talked about. Jason rubbed one hand across the back of his neck. I never meant. He stopped himself again. The sentence seemed impossible to finish. Emily turned toward him for the first time since Thomas had revealed my name. Jason. He looked at her hopefully. Yes? When was the last time you actually asked my father anything about his life? Jason blinked. Emily. No. Answer me. He looked down briefly. I do not know. Did you ever ask him why he spent so many Saturdays away? I assumed. She interrupted him softly. Exactly. The word was not spoken with anger. Somehow that made it hurt even more. Around us, conversations quietly resumed, but they sounded different now. They were no longer centered on surprise. They had become reflections. I overheard fragments drifting from neighboring tables. Imagine helping people for 18 years without telling anyone. My grandfather was like that. We spend too much time celebrating people who talk instead of people who serve. Those quiet conversations spread naturally through the ballroom. No one directed them. No one encouraged them. The truth had begun doing its own work. Thomas remained beside me while Margaret prepared the stage for the final auction. Richard, he asked quietly, may I tell them one more story? I smiled. You have never needed my permission. He laughed softly. Old habits. He stepped back to the microphone. There is one detail that belongs to tonight. He looked toward me with obvious affection. 3 months ago, when Richard signed the authorization allowing us to reveal his identity, he asked the question almost reluctantly. I had stared out the window for several moments before answering. Thomas now repeated those words aloud. I am getting older. If someone younger sees this and decides to help quietly because of it, then perhaps it is finally worth telling the story. Several younger guests nodded thoughtfully. One young couple sitting near the auction stage quietly reached for each other's hands. Thomas smiled. That answer convinced every member of our board. He stepped away from the podium and looked at me once more. You still inspire people without trying. Before I could respond, another unexpected voice came from the back of the ballroom. Mr. Bennett? Everyone turned. A woman in her early 30s slowly stood. She wore a simple navy evening dress and held her auction catalog tightly against her chest. I apologize for interrupting. Thomas smiled warmly. Please. Her voice trembled slightly. My name is Dr. Olivia Sanders. She looked directly at me. I never knew your name until tonight. My heart skipped quietly. The name sounded familiar, though I could not immediately remember why. She smiled through tears, but I recognized the sentence about making someone else's life easier. The ballroom grew quiet once again. I still have the handwritten note you sent through the foundation after my father died. She reached carefully into her handbag and removed a small folded card protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. I carry it everywhere. I stared at the card from across the room. Even from that distance, I recognized my own handwriting. Olivia's voice became steadier. That note stayed in my pocket through medical school, through residency, through every difficult night when I wanted to quit. She paused, taking a slow breath. There is something I have wanted to say for 14 years. She took one step forward, still holding the worn card carefully in both hands. And after what happened tonight, I believe everyone here deserves to hear it. Dr. Olivia Sanders held the small plastic sleeve with both hands, as though it contained something far more valuable than paper. The ballroom remained completely silent while she looked from the note to me again. 14 years ago, she began, my father died 3 weeks before my final tuition payment was due. I was 23 years old, working nights at a grocery store, and wondering how I was going to finish nursing school before I decided to continue into medical school. She smiled faintly through her tears. I thought my dream had ended. She unfolded the card with extraordinary care. The foundation approved an emergency scholarship, but what changed my life was not the money. It was this. Her voice grew softer as she read, Olivia, your circumstances may slow your journey, but they do not define your destination. One day, when your hands have the chance to heal someone else, that will be all the thanks I ever need." She lowered the card. I have carried those words every single day since then. There was not a sound anywhere in the ballroom. Even the musicians quietly lowered their instruments. Olivia continued. "Last winter, a frightened little boy came into the emergency room after a terrible car accident. His mother apologized over and over because she could not afford the treatment she believed he needed. She smiled gently. I remembered that note. I stayed with them long after my shift ended because someone had once done something similar for me without asking for recognition. She looked directly at me. Kindness survives because someone chooses to pass it forward. I felt my eyes grow warm, and for a moment, I saw Helen standing beside our old kitchen window again, smiling the way she always had whenever we talked about helping others. She used to tell me, "Love does not disappear when you give it away. It multiplies." I had believed her then. Standing there in that ballroom, I realized she had been right all along. Olivia walked slowly toward me and extended the small card. "I think this belongs to you." I shook my head gently. "No." She looked surprised. I smiled. "It belongs to the person who carried it through every difficult day. Keep it." She pressed the card against her heart and nodded. "I will." Without thinking, Emily stepped forward and embraced Olivia. Neither woman spoke for several seconds. They simply held each other while dozens of strangers quietly watched. It felt less like a celebration and more like a family remembering something important together. When Emily finally turned toward me, tears still rested on her cheeks. "Dad," she whispered, "I spent so many years believing I knew everything that mattered about you." I smiled softly. "Parents keep parts of themselves hidden sometimes." She shook her head. "Not because they are ashamed." "No," I answered. "Sometimes because they hope their children will build their own reasons for doing good." She nodded slowly. "I understand that now." Jason remained several feet away. He looked smaller somehow. Not because anyone had humiliated him, but because certainty had quietly left him. After a long silence, he walked toward me. His voice was lower than I had ever heard it. "Richard," I looked at him. "I owe you an apology." I waited. He took a slow breath. "Not only for tonight." His eyes drifted toward the floor. "For years I judged you by things that never mattered. I confused income with value, visibility with character." He looked back up. "I thought success meant being the person everyone noticed." I answered calmly. "Many people believe that." He nodded once. "I did." Another silence settled between us. Finally, he said, "I cannot change what I said." "No," I replied, "but you can decide what kind of man says the next thing." He closed his eyes briefly before answering, "Then let me begin with this. I am sorry." There was no audience left for that apology. No applause followed it. That was probably why it sounded sincere. I reached out and shook his hand. "Thank you." Walter laughed quietly behind us. "That is the Richard Bennett I have known for 40 years. Thomas smiled as he watched the exchange. "Sometimes," he said, "the greatest gift is not being proven right. It is giving someone the chance to become better." The remainder of the evening unfolded differently than anyone had expected. The final auction raised more money than any previous gala in the Foundation's history. Yet what people talked about while leaving the ballroom had very little to do with the auction itself. They spoke about anonymous kindness, about promises kept over decades, about the possibility that ordinary people could quietly change lives without ever appearing in headlines. A few weeks later, Emily drove to my house in Lexington on a cool Saturday morning. She carried 2 paper cups of coffee and an old photo album she had found while cleaning her attic. We sat on the back porch watching autumn leaves drift across the yard. She pointed to one photograph of Helen planting flowers. Mom looked happy. I smiled. She always believed every season deserved something beautiful. Emily closed the album. "Would you show me the places she loved helping?" I looked at her. "You mean the literacy center?" She nodded. "The scholarship office, the community pantry, all of it." I smiled. "I would like that." Over the months that followed, we visited those places together. Sometimes Jason came too. He did not speak very much during those visits. Instead, He carried boxes, painted walls, assembled shelves, and listened to the stories of people whose lives had been changed by simple acts of generosity. One afternoon, while we were leaving the literacy center, he stopped beside me. "Richard? Yes? I finally understand something." "What is that?" He looked toward a young mother reading with her daughter inside the building. "You were never trying to build a reputation." I smiled. "No, you were trying to build people." I rested one hand gently on his shoulder. Buildings eventually wear out. Investments rise and fall. Even our names fade with time. I looked toward the children laughing inside the center. But if you help someone believe in themselves, part of your life keeps walking through the world long after you are gone. That winter, the foundation officially announced the Helen and Richard Bennett Legacy Scholarship. I accepted only one request from the board. Every recipient would receive the same handwritten message Helen and I had believed in from the beginning. Sinly Fither Sinny one Sinly from that a read. Sinly one in the papas and alls. These days I still wake early. I still drink my coffee by the kitchen window where Helen and I once planned ordinary Saturdays that somehow became extraordinary years. The house is quieter now, but it no longer feels empty. Emily visits often. Jason never arrives without asking if there is anything that needs fixing around the house. Walter still insists my coffee is too strong, and Olivia occasionally sends letters describing another young patient who reminds her why compassion matters. Looking back, I realized that the most important thing revealed that night was never my name. It was the simple truth that a person's worth cannot be measured by the applause they receive, but by the quiet difference they leave behind in the lives of others. And if there is one lesson I hope remains after my own story is forgotten, it is this. The kindest people you will ever meet are often the ones whose greatest acts are the ones you never see. The first spring after the gala arrived quietly. The snow melted from the edges of my backyard in Lexington, and the first green shoots pushed through the soil Helen had loved, tending every April. For years, I had worked in that little garden alone, carrying her old watering can from one flower bed to the next, speaking to her in silence more often than I admitted to anyone. This year felt different, not because life had suddenly become perfect, but because peace had finally become stronger than disappointment. One Saturday morning, I heard a familiar knock on the front door. When I opened it, Emily stood there holding a small wooden box wrapped with a faded blue ribbon. Jason stood a few steps behind her, carrying a shovel over one shoulder with an awkward smile that reminded me more of the young man I had first met than the executive who had once measured people by titles and applause. "We thought you might need some help today," Emily said. I smiled. "Come in." We spent the morning working in the garden exactly the way Helen would have wanted. Nobody rushed. Nobody checked their phones every few minutes. Jason dug fresh holes for the new rose bushes, while Emily carefully arranged young lavender plants along the stone path. I trimmed the old maple tree that shaded the porch. Every now and then we stopped to drink lemonade and simply enjoy the quiet. It reminded me that healing rarely arrives through dramatic moments. More often, it comes disguised as ordinary afternoons shared with people who have finally learned how to listen. Around lunchtime, Emily handed me the wooden box. "I found this while cleaning the attic," she said. Mom labeled it in her handwriting. I untied the ribbon carefully. Inside were dozens of handwritten letters Helen had made. One envelope simply read, "Open when you finally understand what kindness really means." Emily looked at me with tears already forming. "May I?" she asked. I nodded. She unfolded the letter with trembling hands. Helen's familiar handwriting filled the page. "Dear Emily, if you are reading this, then perhaps life has finally taught you something your father and I could never explain with words. The people who love you most will not always advertise their sacrifices. Some of the greatest gifts arrive so quietly that you only recognize them years later. Never mistake silence for absence, and never measure love by how loudly someone speaks about it." Emily could not finish reading. She quietly folded the letter and held it against her chest. Jason looked away, giving her the privacy she deserved. After a long silence, he spoke. "Richard." "Yes?" "I spent years trying to impress people who barely remember my name today." He looked toward the flower beds. "Meanwhile, the man I underestimated spent decades changing lives that will continue long after all of us are gone." I shook my head gently. "Life is not a competition, Jason. I know that now." He paused before continuing. I started volunteering at the literacy center every Wednesday evening. I smiled. Walter mentioned seeing you there. Jason laughed quietly. I thought he might. How is it going? He looked toward the children playing across the street. At first, I kept wondering whether anyone noticed I was helping. He smiled at himself. Then one little boy asked me to help him sound out a sentence. He looked back at me. For 30 minutes, nothing else mattered. That is usually how it begins, I said. The months continued to pass. The Helen and Richard Bennett Legacy Scholarship welcomed its newest class of students that autumn. I attended the orientation only because the board convinced me that the recipients wanted to meet the people whose values had shaped the program. Instead of giving a speech about success, I simply pulled an old carpenter's pencil from my pocket. It was scratched, worn smooth with age, and barely long enough to hold comfortably. I placed it on the